Hey, Howell here. What I'm going to do today is talk about the Essenes, and the Essenes being a sect of Judaism from 2nd century BC through to the 1st century AD in an area known as Qumran, which is northwest of the Dead Sea, which is Israel or Palestine. And the name Essenes is where we get the word essence from, but the name Essenes means healing or doctor. What makes them important is that they form what must be the pivotal foundation of what we call Christianity today. And I've looked at the origins of possible origins of Judaism with the Canaanites and the Hyksos Israelite possible connection. And I've looked into another origin of Christianity, which is the Nag Hammadi text, the Gnosticism. The Essenes were Gnostics, and as John Allegro points out, said this before in his book, The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian Myth, that nobody should be surprised about the mutation from the Essenes into Gnosticism. Now, we know about them from Josephus, who was a historian of the Jewish people, also an army officer, like a senior army officer, writing at the time, similar time towards of Jesus. And then we've got Pliny the Elder, who was a Roman author, and then we got Philo of Alexander, who was a philosopher. But most of all, we know about them from the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered from 1946 and 1947 in Qumran. They were a very similar story to the discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts, the Gnostic library, where these scrolls were found, but by a wandering Bedouin looking for his goat, etc. Very similar story. And they find the Dead Sea Scrolls, and one of these jars had seven scrolls in them. And in them, there was a fragment of every single book of the Old Testament, the Tanakh, except for the Book of Esther, which is interesting because the Book of Esther is the only book in the Old Testament that doesn't mention God. But probably the most notable find in the Dead Sea Scrolls is the Book of Isaiah. Every book, but the Book of Esther, and they all slightly deviate from what we know as the Tanakh today. But the Book of Isaiah that we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls is probably the most notable, because up to that date, the oldest copy of Isaiah was around about 1000 AD. So this is now the oldest copy, and we don't know where that is, somewhere between the 2nd century and the 1st century AD. And in there were psalms and prayers, etc. Now, what's interesting is that the Essenes were obviously they're a very ascetic cult, very secretive and very private, and it's all about escaping the material world, and the kingdom is in heaven. So it's quite similar to Christianity in that way. And they were masters of agriculture and arboriculture, I think it's how it's pronounced, which is to do with trees. So the idea is that they became masters of growing food with minimal labor that gave them time to study the law. And any deviation from the law is what creates extreme wealth or poverty. And the study of the law is what frees mankind. And now, if you look at the curse upon Adam, one of them is, and Eve, you shall toil the rest of your days. So in the Kabbalah, the time from Adam to the present day is 6,000 years divided into three sections of 2,000 years. So you could argue that the age of Adam to the age of Abraham, because Adam and Eve, Abraham to Jesus to the present day. So Adam and Eve to Abraham, you could argue, is the age of sin. I know that during that you've got Noah and the Noahide laws and the Academy of Shem. And then you've got from Abraham, you've got the age of the patriarchs and the coming of the law, i.e. the Ten Commandments and the law that you'll find in the Torah. And then from Jesus to the present day is the age of Gentiles, or the age of Pisces to the present day. And one could argue that the master of becoming masters of agriculture and albicoric culture is for them to reverse that curse, so that they don't have to toil for the rest of their day, so they can spend their time studying the law. I assume that's the law that we find in the Old Testament. There was an emphasis on light and good, despite the fact that they were heavily influenced by the Book of Enoch. And the Book of Enoch does have this kind of dark feel to it. The sons of light fighting the sons of darkness. Now, they saw themselves as the sons of light. They saw themselves, if the Israelites, the Hebrews, are the chosen people, then the Essenes are the chosen amongst the chosen, if you like. And then fighting darkness. Some had children, some were celibate. Mostly they were celibate and male. And they had a communal life. Everything was shared. Now, I've read it many times, heard it many times, that socialism, communism comes from the Tanakh. And so this was a communally shared ownership. Personal ownership was seen as something negative. And they were the first community to condemn slavery. Now, the Essenes were highly hierarchical. So there was a 3-year, you joined in this initiation, and you had to be chosen. It wasn't easy to become an Essene. And then there was a 3-year initiation process. And so it became very hierarchical. So it's, where are you? I'm in year 1, year 2. I finished my 3 years. So it was very hierarchical in that respect. And as you went through the years, you were initiated into the allegorical meanings of mostly the Tanakh. And we don't really know too much. I mean, I really tried to sort of look into their teachings in detail, but it's really difficult to find. They were incredibly secretive. And the copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls are very fragmented in their way. Now, in Mark 1, the Gospel of Mark, which is the first Gospel to be written, John is out in the wilderness. Now, that's all it says. It says he's out in the wilderness. But the thing is that what happens then, what I've heard and read so many times, is that that's a reference to the Qumran. That's a reference to Qumran. And that means that John was being an Essene out in Qumran in preparation to meeting Jesus, etc. Now, I'm well aware of this. I think her name is Eleanor, Elior, I think it is, Rachel Elior. She's the professor of mystical Judaism at Jerusalem University. And she believes that the Essenes never existed because in the Dead Sea Scrolls there is no mention of the Essenes. They don't mention themselves. It's Josephus, it's Pliny of Elder, and it's Philo of Alexandria are the ones who actually mention the Essenes. And she believes that the group of people mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls may well have been the Zadoks. And she questions, as her evidence is, why would you have a sect called the Essenes that were ascetic and, the real kingdom is in heaven, which is in contrast to what Judaism is all about. It's all about building a kingdom on earth, bringing heaven down and having the kingdom of heaven on earth. Well, my argument against that is you could argue that's just semantics, a change of name, that whoever wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls was clearly a sect of Judaism, and they were clearly ascetics, and there was clear sort of denial of the world, and they let their clothes run down to threadbare and everything, and they were vegetarians and things like that. The Essenes, what I'm looking at here is the I haven't looked into it that deeply enough to be able to comment beyond that, but what I'm looking at is the Essenes being a pivotal foundation for later Christianity. And so they were into healing and astrology. There's astrotheology all the way through the Old Testament. And then you've got magic, which is obviously, there's loads of magic in the Old Testament with Moses and particularly Solomon, and an angelology. And the Essenes had a falling out with the Sadducees. So the three main groups at that time were the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. And the Essenes had a falling out with the Sadducees, just as is in the gospel story. In the gospel story, there's a falling out with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and some of the rabbis. And their prayer on a Friday, on the Sabbath, began Heavenly Father and Earthly Mother. That's quite Gnostic, isn't it? The ineffable Father, and then the Earthly Mother. In Gnosticism, that would be Sophia, like Mother Earth, Gaia. How many prayers have you heard, particularly in the Anglican Church, that begin with Heavenly Father? And then the other one is more revealing, I and the Father are one. And it looks, well, they all said it. And it looks, quite who I is there is not particularly clear. But that's where that prayer comes from. Or that verse in the Gospel, comes from that prayer, I and the Father are one. Now, the Essenes, another connection is that the Essenes roamed freely throughout Palestine at that time. And knowing that they would be housed, because they had real connections, because they were the ones that gave King Herod the prediction that he would be king when it wasn't so obvious. And he offered them the land around Qumran, and they had royal connections. And so as they roamed freely, they knew that the Essenes were coming. And so that they had confidence that they would be housed and fed. And that's what you get in the gospel story, although they don't tell you that. They don't tell you about the royal connections. They don't tell you about the Essene connection. I believe Jesus is a myth, that the story of the 12 disciples is a myth, but it's based on true stories, and it's based on allegories, and it's based on previous mythical legendary figures. So what you have with Jesus and the disciples it's like the Essenes wandering freely through Palestine with all confidence that they would be housed and fed somewhere. And it was seen to be an honour to have them in your house. And another very similar connection, like a sort of form of Messianic Judaism, where the emphasis is on the Messiah, bringing in the Messiah, connecting with the Messiah on a spiritual level, and bringing on the Messiah. And that's very much the theme in Gnosticism, is that this world was created without the male counterpart, and your job with Sophia is to bring on the male counterpart who was the Messiah. And the physicality of Jesus is very important, because as Jesus comes down to be physical, you are then elevated up to be spiritual, as above, so below, if you're one of the chosen ones, that is. And the idea is waiting for the Messiah, who's born of the lineage of David, and he comes to bring a new world order where God reigns over the blessed state, but only comes about after war. Well, there are two Messiahs, of course. The son of Joseph, who comes with a sword to divide the believers from the non-believers, the clean from the unclean. And then you've got, after the war and the tribulation, the plagues and the poverty, you've got the Messiah, son of David, who comes about, to bring peace, to reap reward of all the wars that have gone on before. And remember, David was a particularly violent, aggressive king. He built a huge empire, and his son Solomon was the one that reaped reward in a more peaceful time. Same story as Tutmosis III. Ahmad Osman, the Egyptian researcher, believes that David is Tutmosis III. Tutmosis III has quite an aggressive, violent empire right up towards Syria. And it's his son, I'm not pronouncing his name properly, Amenhotep who reaps the reward, and Ahmad Osman believes that Amenhotep is Solomon. Yeah, the Messiah who leads the forces of light against darkness, Belial, or Belial sometimes pronounced, and the devil. But there is a priestly Messiah anointed to act as an intermediary between man and God, rather like the Logos. And then we've got the Feast of Love. Now this is where it gets a little bit complicated, because in John Allegro's book, where I got this from, I had to read it twice thoroughly before I could understand it properly. You've got the Feast of Love and the Messianic Banquet. And it sounds like a Gnostic practice. And in it, there's a priest, later 3rd, 4th century, who writes, and he's very highly critical of what he calls the Fibionites, now because of their sexual practices with semen and menstrual blood. But the Fibionites were Gnostics. So whether he's referring, this wasn't a seen practice, and this is where the Gnostics got it from, or the Gnostics were the ones who practiced the sex rituals with semen. It isn't 100% clear, but we know that the Essenes were Gnostics, and it does read as though he's referring to the Essenes, the Gnostic element within the Essenes. So they regarded the sun and moon sacred to them, because they transmit the light of God. And food, this is all part of it. Food is light trapped in matter, and your digestion system is seen as sacred because it digests. It's a tool of the divine to separate light from matter. So you absorb the light into your body. So eating is sacred, rather like the Last Supper, or literally as the Last Supper. And the Messianic Banquet, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's called the Rule of Congregation, with bread, wine and fruit. At least 10 men gathered around the priestly anointed Messiah. The body and blood of God. It's all reading like the Eucharist, isn't it? And then menstrual blood and semen was used in a ritual where the semen is deliberately made. It's not to impregnate a woman, and it's not allowed to touch the ground, and it's smeared over you, and it's eaten, because semen is seen as the ultimate food, where the light is trapped in matter, and your digestion system takes the light away. It takes the matter away, excretes it, and you keep the light. All connected to the tree of life. The Essenes have on the many-fruited tree on which the Master is crucified. So we've got many pictures in Christian culture and in Jewish culture of Jesus being hung to a tree or crucified to a tree, and the tree looking like the tree of good and of good knowledge of good and evil. And then there's a grapevine around it. So references to figs being bread, being flesh, and the grapevine, wine, and then blood, the many-fruited tree. Now, one of the things which is that in this book that is called the Dead Sea, from Enoch to the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'll leave it in the link below. It seems to confuse the tree of knowledge of good and evil with the tree of life. And the way I see it, with all the duality in the Old Testament, you've got the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, and then you have the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is the tree of death. You eat from this fruit, and this day you will surely die. And I've seen it, heard it, that the roots of the tree are the tree of death, and then what comes above is the tree of life. As above, so below. But I see the tree of knowledge of good and evil as the tree of death. And Jesus is crucified to it. And we've got things like, raising the sick, healing the sick and raising the dead. in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And John Allegro, the author of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian myth, he believes that he's a Jesus like myself. He's a Jesus mythicist. The story of Jesus is a myth, and the story in the Gospels is a myth based on other mythical stories, based on actual historical figures. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is the teacher of righteousness, and he believes this is Jesus. This is where they got the Jesus character from. And it's not 100% clear whether that teacher of righteousness is a physical figure. Rather, like in Gnosticism, it's not 100% clear whether Jesus is an actual physical figure. Many believe it's not. And then finally, what we have is the 7 mirrors of the Essenes. But and I'll go through all of them, their titles, and I'll just pick out a couple that resonate with me. So the idea being that the universe is one sort of gigantic mirror with 7 different aspects. And the first one is the mirror of the present moment. The second one is that we judge. The third one is to see in a person that we've lost or have taken from us. Number 4, patterns of behavior giving away with that we hold dear. Number 5, that our parents showed us, the sacred relationships. The 5, the dark night of the soul. 7, the divine order. And so the present moment is like whatever state of consciousness you're in, whether you're in the sleep state, if you're in the sleep state and you're a character in a sleep state, what will be reflected back to you is something similar to other characters in the dream state. If you're awake in an emotional, mental state, and you're kind of very reactionary and you're kind of lost in some sort of id fantasy, that will be reflected back to you. Similar characters in that fantasy. But if you become very present and you very connect with your environment, that will be reflected back to you. So if you focus your attention on a shell on a wall, at the same time you're having trouble digesting food or whatever, all that will be reflected back to you. So it is acting, the universe is acting as a mirror. And then number 2, that we judge. Now, this is important because this is something that's really misunderstood in sort of modern psychology and New Age teaching. You see something in somebody that you don't like or pushes your buttons, and that's because it's something in you. That's something about you. Not necessarily, because you can be quite disturbed by someone and find yourself judging somebody. And it's not you. I'll give you an example as somebody I come across quite often. He's got mental health issues. And he's got mental health issues, quite so serious, and you can see he must be on very heavy medication. Maybe schizophrenia, I don't know, or bipolar. And I don't have those problems. So he's not reflecting back something inside me. For some reason, he's pushing my buttons. And it's maybe I've had bad experiences with people like that in my past. But it's for me to look at why I have a bad experience when I see him. And I tend to look away as a result of it. But which is fine because you're protecting yourself. But at some point, you've got to sort of, the universe is asking you to challenge you to ask yourself, why is this happening? And so that concludes my story, my talk on the Essenes. And thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video.